I'm very lucky to have gotten to know Pat quite early on in my time at Clinks. And we try and catch up with each other every now and again. And for 5 years, I've watched you try and change the system for people who have been designated a certain role by demonstrating how that can be different in your own organisation. So we're going to have a chat, aren't we? And I'm going to ask you some questions. Pat, you say that you have transformed Mayday from a traditional supported housing provider to a UK influencer for systemic change. How did that all start?
Well, Anne, I'll tell you that we certainly had no idea what we're letting ourselves in for when we started out. And it must be about 9 years ago now. Mayday Trust, who I'm sure everybody's heard of, not maybe, was started actually by 2 probation officers in 1979. But in 2011, when I joined, it was fairly traditional supported housing and charity. And we had 70 staff, £4 million turnover, and we provided 240 units of accommodation. But I was brought in as CEO to look at mergers and acquisitions. The phrase that we stuck to at that time was, "This isn't a rainy day, this is climate change." You know, we were totally state funded, supporting people grant and housing benefits. So the board saw the writing was on the wall, things were going to change. And we came very, very close to a merger. But at the last minute, we decided to take a look as, can we do something that might be more mission focused? We could see that about 70% of the people who were living in our accommodation weren't going to be priority need. A lot of them had high rent arrears. So I think that, you know, to be honest about it, austerity was the original driver, although very soon mission became the purpose. And we did something that I think that we never honestly had really done before. We talked to people. We had loads and loads of conversations, maybe a couple hundred conversations. And we didn't, it wasn't an academic study, it wasn't research, there was nothing formal about it. We didn't have focus groups, but we sat on the street, we sat on park benches, and we just listened to what people had to say. And then we went away and really thought about what the conversations were. And I can honestly say that over the last 9 years, we have transformed every bit of the organisation as a result of what we heard.
So what did you hear? Because it must have been, you know, it's certainly changed the landscape and it's changed Mayday. So you must have heard some big home truths.
I think what people said was probably very obvious for it all, but hearing it being said again and again, and actually we have turned it into a sort of way of being in the organisation. We call it our wisdoms. It's a sort of deep listening to those multiple conversations. So not the loudest voice or not the representation, but what you will hear when you talk to loads of people is really themes emerging that we set our strategic direction by. But the 2 things that really stood out, and people have referred to it already, there's 2 things that people said when we first talked to them, and that was the system, and particularly the criminal justice system, the homeless system. When you first enter it, it is at best humiliating, intrusive, embarrassing, dehumanizing. But I think what we were going on to see was that actually people were becoming trapped in services, and that what we were seeing is people being institutionalized. And then the second thing that we learned was the results actually weren't good enough. And this was supported by St Andrews University's data from Supporting People grants. There was too few people moving out of services. and maintaining happy lives.
So that's really quite stark, isn't it? If you think about everything that you did as an organisation, and you're not, you know, you're a great organisation, but you're not completely unique, are you? So there's quite a few organisations that people sitting here today will be thinking, oh, that's what we do, that's what we did. So if we think about that, that's really quite stark, because there's very many of us trying to do the best and most compassionate and impactful thing, and yet the impact is so very detrimental to people in so many ways, that personal feelings of embarrassment and humiliation and being trapped in a system that, no matter, you know, pouring good money after bad, people weren't able to move on. They weren't, you know, to kind of phrase, achieving those meaningful outcomes, but they were basically doing what you were for, which was to move into a home of their own and move away from that system.
I think that's what we definitely saw, is that there was many of us who absolutely really care, and there's many people that have that compassion and that belief in people that they're working with. But with all of those experiences, and certainly in our attempt to really drive a person-led service, we would say that however hard we tried as individuals and as caring organisations, the system has become totally dehumanised to the extent that it's doing harm.
So how did you get to that conclusion, I suppose? And after that, you think about, like, what kind of systems, what systems are you talking about, and what systems did you seek to change?
I'd like to start to say that it has been hell. The journey to drive a person-led response hasn't been an easy one. And so when people say to me, we deliver strength-based work, person-led work, I think, how was it hard for us? Where did we do wrong? But I can remember it that in 2012, we brought all of the staff together. I remember it because it was a cold, snowy February day. We almost cancelled. And everybody was there, and we presented these new ideas for trying something different. We threw out all of the existing policies, procedures, and just purely based on what people had told us, we said we were going to respond differently. And we didn't expect everybody to be up for it. We understood that some people wouldn't, and we wanted to be honourable, so we offered redundancy. 50% of the staff left. It was pretty terrifying. But that was just the beginning, and I could spend a long time talking about all of the other terrifying moments that we have. I can remember that we separated out and created different housing and support staff. And the first thing that happened was the rent arrears went through the roof. And the board said to me, don't worry, you know, that's very clear that what we learned was a lot of what we thought was support was actually chasing people to pay the rent. But I think we learned things like how people are pathologized and labeled with a mental health problem, when actually many were having a very understandable response to their situation. But that it was very easy for us as an organisation to slip into that as a survival strategy. If I can show that I can work with people with mental health problems, I might be able to cover that funding gap. But the impact on that person, the extra label, instead of helping many people, what it made was it even harder, both practically and psychologically, to move out of the system. And we learned huge, really significant things, like in our wisdom from behind closed doors. Many people in supported housing said they were there because there was absolutely no other way to get a roof over their heads. You know, with probation officers begging us to take people out of prison, saying they had multiple needs, they needed supported housing. And the cost of supported housing is about £4 billion a year. But when we talk to people, they were telling us, you know, the high rents in supported housing just created barriers for us. You know, we couldn't get on with our life. We couldn't get a job. We didn't necessarily have the contact with the family that we wanted. And then people told us about some nature of that support that they were being offered. It wasn't personalised at all. Standardised, often to the lowest denominator, you know, this sort of tenancy support for all, debt classes. And I remember meeting an accountant in Bedford who said to me, Pat, I don't need any more budgeting classes. I need the drug dealer to stop following me to the ATM. I need to get out of here. So we learned that many people were worn down by the system and had lost hope and motivation. And, you know, all what was said in the last session is don't underestimate, you know, when you have lost hope that things can be different, what big barrier that is for you to get on with your life and to get out of the system. So our board made a decision, and we had two strategic aims. One was that we would only work in a way that treated people as people, so in that sort of strength-based way, and we would share what we'd learned. We would drive that person-led work. And that was very easy to say. The board took that decision in October 2015. But what it meant in reality was we had to talk to our commissioners, because obviously we were going to work in a different way. It meant we moved out of Warwickshire and Bedfordshire. We'd been there 30 years. But we were able to negotiate with Oxford and Westminster, who wanted a person-led response. We had to dispose of 50% of our housing stock. We moved away from 3 major contracts. One of them was a 5-year contract. We just bought a 1.5 million property for mental health. But of course, our new thinking was about putting people with a label under one roof. No. So we give back that contract. We tubied 40 staff. We had 100% board turnover. And at a time, you know, when most organisations were batten down the hatches, we invested £1 million of our reserves to really show that you really can have impact if you deliver person-led work.
So what was happening, sorry to cut across you there, to the people that you worked with while all this was going on? How did you take people with you who were so used to having paternalistic services given to them in a certain way?
Yeah, it was really interesting, because when we changed, some people got it and flew. And it wasn't necessarily the people that were just new to the system. Some people who had been knocking around it for a long time just appreciated being respected and had a bit of power in their lives. But, you know, we worked really closely. Every month we met up with the coaches and the frontline teams and people that we worked with. And, you know, it sort of emerged that just building on people's strengths wasn't enough. You know, coaches were saying to me, that's all very well talking about people's strengths, but if you're trying to get your kids back, you're not wanting to have that conversation. So we made it really individual, person-led. People's lives were so different. You know, and you talked earlier on about, you know, these groups of people, you know, arsonists, sex offenders that you don't work with. We worked with a woman who 14 years she'd been trying to get accommodation because she'd committed arson in her past. When we looked into it and dug into it, she wasn't even there when the fire was started in her flat, but she had been labelled with that arson. So we treated people as people and individualised the work. And then what we saw was that the longer people were in the system, the greater harm, the greater institutionalisation was happening. So the sort of response evolved to be what we call our personal transition service. But that really was only the start, because we had to transform our entire organisational culture based on the work that was evolving.
So we will run out of time. So I'd like to quickly take me through kind of how did you do that organisation change and culture change? Because I think we can signpost people to places where you've done that articulately. But I also want you to cover off for me, like, what were the system barriers and your kind of key learnings in the last 9 years? So if you had your time again, I don't know if you would put yourself through it again, but you're here standing strong, right? So what was it? It's what has happened in those 9 years, and what's the big learning for others? Because I think this is a time when people might need to press reset in their own charities and social enterprises.
Well, we moved from seeing the need from systems change to system damage. And what we saw and what we researched later was that if you continually focus on people's weaknesses and all of this support and, you know, tell us about your problems, that people lose hope and motivation. And that, you know, that there's a body of evidence out there. And what was happening was that we were continually trying to fix people's problems, and people were becoming totally disconnected from what they're good at, what they could bring to the party. We'd segregated people to the extent that, you know, there was the homeless haircuts, the homeless doctors. We had everything, people's sense of identity, status, all was within services. So there was this, we in services had created this huge psychological leap to get out and move on with your life. And we'd pathologized people so much that they couldn't get a vision of what their life could be and look like. And because all they could see was, we have this lifelong condition. And I think the key learning for us, really, in terms of being very clear about what's wrong with what's going on now, is that a lot of our energy and focus in the sector is trying to find better and better solutions to fix those individual people's problems. You know, we've categorized people as complex needs, but what we heard from people was that they didn't have complex needs. They were institutionalized in systems that were fixated in trying to solve people's individual problems rather than being able to cope with what was going on in people's lives. So the person says, if you give me a decent home where I can see my daughter, I might be tempted to stop drinking. What the system says is, you need to stop drinking before we'll move you along this pathway out of this hostel. A total disconnect between what is needed and what is provided. And we learned that people were internalizing, taking personally these problems that weren't theirs. You know, we need to listen to people who are saying, I'm not depressed, I'm living in poverty. I have not got bipolar, I was raped. I just need a flat, I'm frustrated, I don't have anger issues. So the dominant problem that we're trying to deal with, that we focus on now, is identifying with the people what the system barriers are and trying to overcome those, because it's not about complex needs, it's misdirected. It is about that broken system. And I think when we want to look at solving homelessness, mental health, rehabilitating people from prison, the answers aren't found in Finland or the DSM of mental health disorders. It's absolutely walking in people's shoes. And we're trying to fix systems that won't be fixed. You know, it's not about, we don't need health to talk to criminal justice or homelessness to talk to mental health. We need to listen to that collective voice. And what we've learned is that we can't assume that people need a service. They don't need more services. They don't need more mental health support. They don't need more efficient joined up commissioning. They need to listen and respond appropriately. And, you know, we mentioned Cormac Russell. We absolutely need to invest in communities where people get their community response and can contribute. And I think most of all, people need to take control of their lives, because that's what we saw is there's a lot of structural issues that are hidden and lack in focus because we're too busy trying to fix people.
There's loads in that, and I wish like we'd made the conference a whole hour, a minimum of an hour longer, but we didn't, and I'm regretting it now. So we've got a few minutes left. For me, the last word should definitely be with the people that you spoke to, and that you continue as an organisation to speak with. So do you want to maybe end on a high note of the poem that you sent me.
This poem is called If the System Could Talk. When I manage and control your life, you become my risk. When I manage and control your life, I need outcomes. So I need you to comply with my idea of my morality for you. You will not drink. You will work. You will sustain your accommodation. You will not use drugs. When I manage and control your life, I cannot afford to give you choice or say. When I manage and control your life, I will determine what your problems are. I will not ask you. I am not interested in what you can manage yourself. When I manage and control your life, you will be rewarded when you comply and share your story widely with gratitude, so you help me raise funds to manage and control the lives of others. When I manage and control your life, you will be owned by me and never leave.
Pat McArdle, thank you very
In the
much.
best Irish accent.
Seamus Heaney, be proud of you right this very moment. There you are.